is one of those issues that I waffle on. I mean, I'm pretty opinionated about most things, and I've given most things enough thought to come to one side or the other. But when it comes to helping someone end their life if they are at the end of a horrible terminal illness with no hope for recovery, I tend to think, why shouldn't someone be allowed? But leave it to our friends to the north to take that simple concept and turn it into something wildly different. And joining me now from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute is Daniel Dorman. And Daniel writes for them and is one of their young emerging voices. And he wrote a column recently in National Review about their medically assisted in dying program. It's a MAID is the acronym. Like, they're just cleaning things up by helping you kill yourself at the end of your life, or in the middle of your life, or in the beginning of your life, depending on what the situation is. Daniel, welcome to the program, first of all.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Mandy. Really, really glad to be here.
If you could you give my listeners who don't pay as much attention to Canadian politics as I do, kind of the background on how the medical assistance in dying program got started and where it's gone since it's kicked off?
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2015, the Canadian Supreme Court found a right to medically assisted death, or I believe that's a euphemism for what is euthanasia, or is probably the more accurate term. But they found the right for that in Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which contains the right to life and liberty. I think that is obviously contradictory and odd in itself, but we can get into that in a moment. And then since then, there's just been this sort of increasing exemptions for culpable homicide committed by a medical practitioner, which is the most accurate language for what's happened, which has led euthanasia to become a very significant cause of death in Canada. More than 4% of deaths in Canada are made. And if you look at the last year we have full statistics for is 2022, and there was 13,000 Canadians that were killed by doctors in 2022. So it's out of control. It was clearly a slippery slope. It's not a good situation that Canada's in.
So here's the most recent story that I saw, and I don't have it in front of me, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a woman who was not very old who was having a mental health crisis and went to seek help and was asked about assisted suicide when she was there to get help for her suicidal ideation. So now it's my understanding that they want to extend the number of the group of people that can use MAID to the mentally ill. So if you are having a terrible time, a temporary terrible time, and you're in a deep depression, the Canadian government could say, you know what, why don't you just kill yourself? We'll help you. It'll be painless. Is that accurate?
So fortunately, there was a law coming into place in March of this year. It was supposed to come into place that if your sole underlying condition was mental illness, that you would be eligible for euthanasia. Thankfully, there was such outcry from civil society, from concerned doctors, from concerned lawyers that they've pushed that back to 2027. So right now, if you're just mentally ill, thankfully you're not eligible. I mean, I think it's absolutely crazy that it's on the table that a doctor would respond to someone's suicidal ideation by offering them death. Like, I'm deeply concerned by that. So I hope it is permanently off the table by 2027 as civil society continues to speak out against it.
So who is using assisted suicide in Canada now?
So in 2018, there was the expansion of euthanasia to people whose death is not reasonably foreseeable. So when it first came in, it was, as you mentioned, somebody who's suffering, who's terminally ill. And I think there's still a discussion there, particularly if you have a state paying for healthcare, of whether the state should ever be involved in directly killing people. But it became a very different conversation because the eligibility has just opened up more and more and more to people who maybe have some condition or not. The eligibility is wide open, and the safeguards are being eroded pretty quickly. So that was in 2018. And so at this point, I've heard stories of someone with a disability going to the hospital with pneumonia and being offered death. So, I mean, of course, that's a one-off situation, but the attitude is certainly that this is a viable option or a standard of care that should be offered to people. There was actually a UN special rapporteur for the rights of people with disabilities that said Canada's off the mark in our euthanasia laws here because of precisely the ways it would disadvantage disabled people in Canada's medical system. So it's very concerning, and too many people are eligible, I think, is what I'd say in summary.
How much of this is designed to do with the pressures that are put on socialized medicine? At the end of life care is the most expensive care. Do you think there's a financial component to the embrace that we're seeing?
I hope not. I've noted before that, during one of the last debates in Canada's parliament, the parliamentary budget officer was asked essentially to cost out, what this program would cost, basically to cost out its savings for the healthcare system in Canada. So I think, cynically, you could say that is maybe part of the equation. I think most of the sort of activists for MAID in Canada, as they would call themselves, are motivated by compassion. It's just a very wrong-headed form of compassion and a very skewed version of a skewed understanding of liberty if you're offering people death instead of a full life and liberty.
So what is the next step? Obviously, the pushback on mentally ill people being added to this list, but are they working to expand it to other areas, or is this just become a snowball rolling downhill that can't be stopped?
It certainly feels like a snowball rolling down a hill. It certainly feels like a slippery slope, and I'm not sure where it'll stop. I mean, another area of concern is whether it'll be offered to minors. So hopefully that won't come on the table. Right now, a minor is not eligible. Or actually another piece of the debate is whether people need to consent in the moment. There's been some suggestion that even if somebody was objecting to being killed in the moment, if they had consented a week ago, that they would still be carried out. Just very concerning on that front too. So you hope that some of these safeguards could be put back in place as opposed to eroded. Certainly if Canada gets a new government after an election, I think that's a strong possibility.
It's just from your, and I'm not asking for a scientific guess here, I'm asking for just a gut guess. Will there be a new government in Canada? Because some of the things we're seeing out of Canada, the restrictions on free speech, the sort of totalitarian nature that took over during COVID, these things are profoundly concerning. And do you think they were enough for Canadians to say we want to go in a different direction?
I think almost any pollster in Canada would tell you, I mean, if we had an election today, we'd see a majority Conservative government and the Liberals pushed out significantly. So I'd say that, chances are, yes, Canada will see a new government formed under the Conservatives. And it remains to be seen in many ways what the Conservatives will actually do once they get power on some of these issues. I know that many in the party are opposed to the expansion of MAID in its current form, at least. So I think there's hope on this issue and others.
Daniel Dorman with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, I appreciate your time on this. It's something that I'm going to be paying attention to, and perhaps we'll talk about it again in the future.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Thank you, Daniel. That is Daniel Dorman, and you can read his work. I put a link to the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, their public policy institute in Canada. And if you want to know more about Canadian issues, that's the place to go.